Thunder rumbled, awakening Sarah. The woman opened her eyes to the sound of rain tapping on the window pane. A May thunderstorm, she mused. The last month of spring had been hot and dry, making the rain a welcome change. She opened the curtains to admire the rain cleansing the young leaves of dust. Looking down, she noticed a large black car in the deserted street. Beside it stood 3 men, 2 clad in black and the third, near the car, in jeans and a white sweater. He seemed to be searching for someone among the apartment windows. Suddenly the doorbell rang. Sarah hurried into the hallway, but Shaunette overtook her. The woman was already up and preparing breakfast, so she reached the door first. "Shaunette," said the neighbour's boy, Tommy, "they've come for your granny. They have a nice car, and they look serious. They gave me $20. "Hold on, who's come?" Shaunette interrupted. "I don't know. They only asked me to call Sarah Reed," answered the boy. Sarah looked at Tommy in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone for a long time, and was certain that no one was looking for her. Shaunette turned to the elderly woman and asked, "Do you understand what's happening?" "Absolutely no, Shaunette," Sarah replied, "but there is indeed a car parked there, and there are strangers near it." "So stay here, and I'll go and see what's going on," Shaunette said resolutely, putting on her shoes and throwing a light sweater over her dress. She left the apartment, closed the door behind her, and headed for the stairs with Tommy following her. Sarah Reed was born in a small mountain town into an ordinary family where most of the men worked at the metallurgical plant, the town's only large enterprise. Sarah's father, Jacob, was also a metallurgist. He had married Rebecca, Sarah's mother, immediately after returning from military service. They had loved each other since school and dreamed of a large, happy family. However, after Sarah's birth, Rebecca was unable to get pregnant again, and Jacob desired a son, or better yet, several sons. His dissatisfaction with his wife and resentment over her inability to provide heirs often led to arguments. "You're nothing. Why do I need a woman as useless as you?" When Jacob caused such a scene, the woman attempted to pacify him, but most often she used to hide in her daughter's room. Sarah did not do well at school. She got from C's to B's. However, Rebecca always encouraged her daughter to pursue further education or a vocational course. She always emphasized the importance of having a profession in today's world. "Without a profession, you can't survive," her mother would say. "You could become a hairdresser, a cook, even a seamstress, but you must be capable of working." Rebecca held high hopes that Sarah would be her pillar of support in her old age, as there was no one else she could rely on. But at the age of 16, Sarah became pregnant. For several months she managed to hide her sin, but when her belly became noticeably rounded, she had to confess to her mother, and the latter, shaking with fear, told her husband. Jacob's shouting and swearing that night was heard throughout the street. He shouted so loud that the walls shook, and the dishes rattled in the cupboard. "You little brat! I'm going to shake it out of your belly and the nonsense out of your head." He was rushing around the house, swinging at his daughter, throwing things around in anger. "You've disgraced us. People will say about us that Jacob's daughter is a doormat." "Jacob, calm down. Our daughter shouldn't be nervous now." Rebecca tried to calm her husband. She shouldn't be nervous, but she can flirt with men," yelled her father, not relenting. "Stand back, mother. I'm going to teach her a lesson." "Don't, Jacob. Don't touch our daughter. I'll take her to the doctor tomorrow and sort everything out." Rebecca went to the cupboard, where she had a bottle of whiskey, hidden behind other dishes. She took out a shot glass, slammed it on the table and poured. "Drink up, Jacob. Drink up and calm down." The man quickly downed his drink, and Rebecca refilled his glass. She knew her husband would relax after a few drinks, and perhaps he wouldn't hit Sarah. She didn't want to bring her pregnant daughter with bruises to the doctor's office. Walking in silence from the women's clinic the next day, Sarah and Rebecca wondered what the future held. The pregnancy was too advanced, and there was nothing to be done about it. Instead, the doctor instructed them to complete a medical examination and get tested. When questioned about the baby's father, Sarah claimed there wasn't one. "I should report this to the police and Child Protective Services," the doctor said sternly. "You must tell me who did this to you." "He was just passing through town. He's gone now and I don't know where he is." "Do you at least know his name or where he's from?" When Sarah remained silent, the doctor sighed. Jacob and Rebecca were worried about their daughter, and she seemed to be obsessed with her baby. She knitted sweaters and booties from yarn, sewed bonnets, decorated the room. Her only focus was on the baby she was expecting. Sarah's baby decided to come much earlier than expected. She gave birth to a boy in the 8th month. From the onset of labour until the baby was born, Sarah's parents were at the hospital, and they didn't leave. "As long as everything is fine," Rebecca prayed. "Stop whining," Jacob rudely interrupted. "Rejoice at least in the fact that she will not be an eyesore with her belly. We'll not have a reason for neighbours to discuss our daughter, to embarrass us in front of everyone." When the doctor came out to speak to the parents, they both approached her eagerly. "Well, how's our daughter, doctor?" asked the worried Rebecca. "Your daughter gave birth," said the doctor, but before she could finish, Jacob took her by the elbow and led her aside. "I need to talk to you urgently," he insisted, his determined expression preventing the doctor from arguing. "Well, come into my office," she responded. Rebecca moved to join them, only to be stopped by her husband. "Wait here," I said. "I'll be back soon." Bewildered, Rebecca remained in the waiting room, frustrated with her husband's refusal to let her speak with the doctor. When her husband finally appeared in the doorway, Rebecca jumped from her seat. "What did the doctor say, Jacob? What's wrong?" she asked. "A sick, premature child was born," he responded. "What can I say? The doctor said he might not make it." "What do you mean, not make it?" "He might die," he answered bluntly. "Oh, God, how can it be?" wailed Rebecca. "Quiet. Let's go home. You're not needed here anymore. Sarah's asleep. She's been sedated," he responded. At home, Jacob sat in the kitchen with a bottle of whiskey. He barely spoke to his wife, only drinking all the time. The next day, after work, Sarah's parents hurried to the maternity hospital. Jacob seated Rebecca on a chair in the emergency room, saying, "Sit here. I'll find out everything myself." He then headed down the corridor to the doctor's office. His wife waited for him for about half an hour. Jacob returned furious and slammed his fist on the wall. "The baby died," he said. "What?" Rebecca did not understand. "Are you a fool? The baby was premature and sick. It died. That's all." "Wait. Jacob, where's the death certificate? Will they give it to us?" Rebecca suddenly asked. "They'll give it to us when we come to pick up our daughter. Let's go." The man headed for the exit, and Rebecca hurried after him. At home, the woman broke down in tears. She was heartbroken for the baby, her daughter, and the lost opportunity to be a grandmother. "We must ensure the baby receives a proper burial," thought Rebecca. She also couldn't help but worry about her daughter, who probably had already heard the tragic news. The tears just kept flowing. 2 days later, they picked Sarah up from the maternity hospital. She looked pale, thin, and drained. Sarah didn't cry, but silently stood with her parents, waiting for her belongings to be brought out. "Jacob, go get the certificate," Rebecca asked her husband, "and find out when they give us him for burial." "I know what to do. I'm going now," Jacob responded abruptly. He left, and upon his return said, "Let's leave quickly." "What happened? And where's the certificate? And what about the body?" the woman persisted. "I got so mad at them. They don't want to give the body, saying it's not allowed," Jacob exclaimed as he left the hospital, striding down the sidewalk, while Sarah and Rebecca tried to catch up with him. "Why?" "How should I know? They have rules. They gave the death certificate to me, but I got so furious that I tore it up and threw it in their face." "Oh, Jacob, why are you so rude? You should have asked calmly." "How can you speak to them calmly? They ruined the kid, my grandson. They even said it was our own fault for raising our daughter poorly. I just couldn't control myself." At home, Sarah locked herself in her room and didn't come out, no matter how much her mother pleaded. The cry of the baby she had given birth to resonated in her mind. She heard it clearly, as if he were lying next to her and crying. Sarah had barely finished school. Her classmates treated her with mocking and avoided socializing with her. Of course, it was logical for them. They looked forward to their futures, confident that everything was going according to plan. They expected to get an education, find jobs and build beautiful families. However, Sarah's life was different. She already had a relationship with a man who didn't love her at all. Furthermore, she experienced pregnancy but never became a mother. She was already not very sociable, and this painful experience made her further withdraw into herself, becoming like a gloomy shadow. Every time she returned from school, she could feel the neighbours' eyes on her. Of course, not all of them looked at her with contempt. Some women with baby strollers lowered and averted their eyes upon seeing her. They were afraid to imagine what the young woman who had lost her child was feeling. They feared to even momentarily put themselves in her shoes, as they had healthy babies in their strollers. 2 years had passed. Sarah's mother hoped that the wound in her daughter's soul would gradually heal, and she would return to her old self. But it seemed as if something had irrevocably broken inside her. After graduation, the girl landed a job in a supermarket, showing no interest in further education. Her father now drank every evening. After returning home from work, he would sit at the kitchen table, demanding a bottle and a glass. Rebecca found herself automatically buying alcohol after work to avoid his wrath if there was nothing to drink at home. "Jacob, what are you doing to yourself?" Rebecca would ask. "Why are you ruining your health?" "Shut up, you fool," Jacob would rudely snap back. "It numbs my sin. Pour!" To avoid a scene, the wife would dutifully pour the bitter drink into a glass. 2 more years passed, and this Saturday evening mirrored countless others. Jacob relaxed in the kitchen with a beer, while Rebecca cooked something by the stove. Their daughter, Sarah, would soon be back from work and would need to be fed. "Jacob, maybe it's time to stop drinking. Perhaps you could watch some TV at least," suggested Rebecca. "Leave me alone. What's there to watch? Soap operas? Nonsense. Tell me, is our daughter going to mourn the baby forever? She should be getting married by now. How long has she been a burden to us?" "She's not a burden to you. She earns her own money," Rebecca retorted. "I know, but a woman needs a man, or she'll lose herself completely," he insisted. "Calm down. She's been through so much. God forbid, don't you feel sorry for her?" The woman put the lid on the pot and turned off the stove. "What's there to feel sorry for? All women are the same." Jacob waved away. The sound of the door opening echoed from the hallway. Moments later, Sarah emerged in the kitchen with a guy standing next to her, who looked about 10 years older. "Dad, Mum, meet Paul. We're planning to live together," Sarah announced, leaving her parents gobsmacked. "Hello," the guy greeted. Jacob and Rebecca were taken aback, their surprised gazes shifting between Sarah and Paul. They hadn't anticipated such a move from their daughter. Rebecca had assumed Sarah wasn't seeing anyone and certainly wasn't planning to marry. When did all this happen? "Well, great." Jacob extended his hand to the guy. "Come in, sit at the table. Rebecca, set the dinner and get another glass for our guest. Let's talk." The family settled down for dinner. Rebecca placed the plates on the table, served the pasta and meatballs, and took a seat herself. Sarah ate in silence, her eyes downcast. She appeared indifferent to everything happening around her. "Well, let's toast to get acquainted." Father raised his glass and Paul joined him, downing his own in one gulp. "How long have you two been dating?" "A week now, Dad," Sarah replied, toying with her food. Not too long, I must admit." Jacob scratched the back of his head and refilled the glasses. "And you both have already decided to get married?" "No, we won't have a wedding," the daughter replied. "Why not?" "We decided there's no point in spending money at a useless wedding," Paul interjected. "There is no point in gathering a crowd of unnecessary people." "And you think it's acceptable to get married together without a proper wedding, do you?" Jacob retorted, growing angry. "Absolutely," Paul responded, taking another drink. "Look, Rebecca, what they're doing." The indignant father, who was quite tipsy, continued, "I'll get beaten up at the factory for marrying off my daughter and not inviting my team." "Mr. Reed, you can invite your colleagues and celebrate our future happy life," the young man replied. "Have a drink and a snack with them. What do we care? Who are they to us?" Jacob carefully examined his future son-in-law, then slammed his fist on the table so hard that the plates bounced, and Paul's empty glass tipped over, rolled and fell to the floor. "I decide what is important and what is not," the father shouted. "Calm down, Jacob," Rebecca soothed her husband, realizing that a serious scandal or even a fight could erupt from this spark of anger. Jacob took another drink, calmed down slightly, and continued the conversation. "And where do you two plan to live?" "Dad, Paul has his own one-bedroom apartment. It will be sufficient for us," Sarah responded, her demeanour emotionless. She remained unaffected by her father's disapproval and calmly poured tea for the men. "You'd better drink your tea, or you'll both end up completely drunk." "So, there's dwelling. Good," the man approved. "Where do you work? Not at a plant?" "No, sorry, that sort of life isn't for me," Paul replied. "I have a small clothing shop in the market. I buy cheap in the capital and sell at a higher price here." "So, you're a bargainer," Jacob interrupted. "Why should I be a bargainer?" Paul objected. "I'm an entrepreneur." "All the same," Jacob dismissed with a wave of his hand. He fell silent for a moment, then asked in a more peaceful tone, "Are you in love, or what?" "Jacob, love isn't the main thing these days," Paul responded. "What's more important is trust, support, and financial stability between a husband and wife. In the past, girls were married off without love, and they managed to form strong, prosperous families." "Don't say nonsense," Jacob countered, pointing his index finger. "In the old days, parents chose the grooms, but you've appeared from nowhere. We know nothing about you, yet you expect us to hand over our daughter." Paul leaned back in his chair and smiled wryly. "Ask away. I'll answer all your questions." Outside it was already dark. Sarah leaned against the wall, watching her father and Paul discuss her future while they continued to drink. Eventually, the father said in a slurred voice, "Do what you want. Live your life, Paul. I can see you think intelligently, like a businessman." A month later, Sarah and Paul married, and Jacob declared to his wife, "Now, no one can dare to call my daughter a promiscuous girl. She's a married woman now. That's how it is." The capital greeted the new day. Highways, streets and avenues gradually bustled with life as cars filled the roads and people hurriedly went about their day. During the night, a warm summer rain had fallen, cooling the asphalt that had been heated by the intense summer sun. Hannah emerged from her bedroom and descended the stairs. The housekeeper, Erin, greeted her. "Good morning. Shall I make you some coffee?" "Don't worry, Erin, I'll do it myself. Is Arthur still at home?" Hannah asked. "Yes, he's in the dining room having breakfast," Erin replied. "Good," Hannah responded. proceeding to the dining room where her husband was finishing his cheesecake. Erin had been working for the Lewises for 5 years. Her calm demeanour, cleanliness and frugality had made her indispensable to the family. She not only helped maintain the large house and cooked excellently, but she was also able to keep her mouth shut to make sure that what was going on in the house did not go beyond the high brick fence. "Good morning, dear." Hannah pecked her husband on the cheek. "Are you leaving already?"
"Yes, darling, there's a lot to do today," Arthur replied, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I've scheduled a meeting for this morning."
"Will you be back late, as always?" Hannah asked with frustration.
"I'll try not to be late."
The man left the table, hugged his wife, kissed her and headed for the exit.
"Bye. Don't miss me too much."
Hannah and Arthur had been in love since their student days. After graduation, they married. With the help of Arthur's parents, his career quickly flourished. He swiftly assumed his father's position as the general director of a metal processing enterprise. Essentially, he inherited the role when his father chose to retire and enjoy a quiet life in a country house by the sea. Hannah, not needing to work, dedicated her time to her hobby, pottery. A small house was built in their garden, serving as her workshop, where she handcrafted impressive items such as cups, jugs, vases and plates. The couple lived comfortably, able to afford any luxury, but there was something they couldn't buy. For 10 years they had been trying to have a child, but all attempts were unsuccessful. This inability to conceive affected Hannah the most. Meanwhile, Arthur got a phone call from his business acquaintance from the distant mountain town.
"Hi, Arthur, how are you?" "Andrew, hello."
Arthur was delighted by the call from his friend and partner, but he immediately felt a chill run down his back.
"Everything's fine. Why are you calling? Is there a problem at the plant?"
No, don't worry," the voice on the other end of the line reassured him.
"I have some news for you. I got a reply from the orphanage you sent the sponsorship. The director sent me the documents for one boy who she thinks might be the best fit for you. Blue-eyed, light-haired. His health isn't the best, but nothing serious. He's very bright for his age."
"And how old is the boy?" Arthur asked, his heart starting to race.
"He's 2 years old and was left at the maternity hospital right after birth. The mother has waived her rights, so there won't be any issues. There's a couple considering him for adoption, but the principal believes this family wouldn't be good for the boy, and if she were to choose anyone, it would be you and Hannah. Andrew, tell the principal to hold off on anything. I'll call you a little later." "Okay, I'll wait for your call."
Arthur ended the call and started to ponder. His family had considered adoption, but Hannah wanted an infant, not a 2-year-old with a potentially established character. Regardless, the man stored all the documents in the safe and stepped into the reception area.
"I won't be in today. Cancel all my appointments."
When Arthur arrived home, Hannah met him outside. He seldom left work in the middle of the day. She sensed that something had occurred. "Arthur, is there trouble at work?" She embraced her husband. "Why did you come home so suddenly?"
"Actually, I have urgent news to discuss," he replied. "Let's go inside."
Arthur led his wife to the door, arm in arm. They settled in the living room. Erin served tea and placed it on the table in front of them. Hannah watched Arthur intently, awaiting the news.
"Tell me, have you not yet abandoned the thought of adopting a child?" he asked quietly, studying his wife attentively.
"Arthur, did you come home in the middle of the workday to ask me that?" Hannah's eyes showed confusion and surprise. "We could have discussed this tonight."
"No, we couldn't," Andrew called. "There's a boy in the orphanage. He says the boy is intelligent and handsome."
"My God, Arthur, there's always a smart and handsome boy in every orphanage," Hannah exclaimed.
"You know, when Andrew said the orphanage director wanted to meet us, my heart started to race. I got excited and wanted to talk to you. There's a family in town that wants to adopt him. It's in the country, where he won't have a good education or prospects. He'll grow up in a working-class family. What can they provide for him?"
"But we wanted a baby."
"Hannah, a 2-year-old is still very young. We can raise him as our own, and he'll never know he was adopted."
The woman stood up and walked to the window, her gaze falling on the garden lawn, where she imagined her and Arthur's son could play. "When do we have to go?" she asked without turning around.
"As soon as possible," her husband replied. "I'll call the airport and book the tickets."
By morning, they were on their way to meet the boy who might become their son. 5 hours later, a nervous Hannah and Arthur were sitting in the office of the director of the orphanage. "Don't worry so much, Mrs. Lewis. The boy will be brought in soon. Would you like some tea or coffee in the meantime?" The guests from the capital refused, eager to meet the child. "Then let me tell you a little about Taylor," the principal began, pulling out the child's personal file from the cupboard. His 16-year-old mother signed a refusal right after his birth. The child was born prematurely. "I can never understand how one can abandon their own child, whom they've carried under their heart for so long," Hannah said sadly. "Situations are different, Mrs. Lewis," the principal replied. "Not everyone is ready for motherhood. In such cases, it's better for strangers to raise them than a grief-stricken mother." At this moment the teacher entered the office, leading a boy by the hand. He was pulling a toy car on a string behind him. The Lewises looked attentively at the little boy. Blonde-haired, with beautiful blue eyes, Taylor seemed like he had stepped straight out of a children's book. "Hello, what's your name?" Hannah asked, squatting down next to him. "Taylor," the little boy responded, unafraid of the unfamiliar lady. "I am Hannah Lewis, and this is my husband Arthur," she introduced, prompting the boy to shift his gaze toward the man. "And how old are you, Taylor?" Hannah asked. Taylor stretched his hand forward, spread out 2 fingers, and announced loudly, 2. The adults present laughed at the sight of the confident child proudly declaring his age. Taylor then stepped forward and offered his toy car to Hannah. "Do you like playing with cars?" she asked. "Yes," Taylor responded enthusiastically. "And would you like to go to a place where there are many, many cars, and they will all be yours?" Taylor nodded his head, appearing direct and confident, despite the adults watching him closely. Hannah found herself thinking that if she had met him under different circumstances, she wouldn't have guessed that his mother had abandoned him, and he had been raised in an orphanage. As Taylor was led away, Arthur and Hannah exchanged glances. Their opinions had coincided throughout their 10-year marriage, and they did so again now. Arthur's eyes seemed to say, "This is our boy," while Hannah's eyes responded, "We will love him more than life." Upon returning home, they began to prepare for adoption. Arthur instructed his lawyer to gather and process all the necessary documents. Meanwhile, Hannah was bursting with anticipation at the thought of finally having a son. "Erin," she instructed, "clean the bedroom next to ours today. Have the guard remove all the furniture. We'll buy everything new, clean, and wash everything. We need to finish the renovations quickly. That will be Taylor's room." "Okay, Mrs. Lewis, I'll take care of everything," Erin responded. The very next day, a team of repairmen was at work in the nursery, and Hannah was in the living room with one of the best interior designers in the capital. The young man, sporting a stylish jacket and a pigtail, was presenting potential projects. Hannah had contacted him the previous day, asking for a rapid design project to decorate the nursery. After working through the night, he now proudly, albeit nervously, presented his proposals. "I like this one," Hannah said, pointing to a design of a room awash with snowy blue. "Great choice. Lots of light, space and air. However, all the furniture here is custom-made, which will take some time," the designer warned. "How much time do you need?" Hannah interrupted. "I think about a month." "I'll give you 2 weeks. Everything should be ready by then." "Understood," the designer replied,
though his voice lacked confidence. 2 weeks later, Arthur journeyed to the town in the mountains to pick up Taylor. Waiting at home, Hannah was restless with worry. What if they didn't get along? When Arthur called from the airport to confirm their flight had landed and they were on their way home, Hannah stepped into the garden. It was festively adorned with balloons and lanterns. A large red battery-powered Jeep and a tricycle stood proudly on the lawn. "Do you think Taylor will like it, Erin?" Hannah asked the young girl. "Don't worry, Mrs. Lewis. You and Mr. Lewis will be the best parents in the world. Don't even worry." The wait for her husband and Taylor's arrival seemed interminable. At last, Arthur's car pulled into the courtyard. Hannah approached her husband and the boy, who Arthur was leading by the hand. "Hello, Taylor, do you remember me?" Hannah asked. "Yes," replied the boy, nodding his head. "You're my good one." The woman hugged the child, tears welling in her eyes. In that moment, she felt like she was embracing her happiness, and she was prepared to do everything to ensure that Taylor had a childhood filled with wonderful memories. The boy integrated into the family with surprising ease. He was never whimsical, always curious, and gladly participated in all the activities the adults were involved in. He would often be with Erin in the kitchen, where she would make him delicious pancakes, shape dumplings, and bake apple pies. In the garden, Taylor included the guard and the gardener in his games. He would daringly drive his Jeep along the paths, chasing the flying butterflies. In the winter, a skating rink was set up on the lawn for Taylor. Arthur and Hannah taught the boy to skate, and afterward they would all enjoy hot tea with delicious almond cookies together. The couple was happy. They had found what was missing in their lives. When Taylor called Arthur Daddy, the man couldn't hide his tears of joy. He scooped the boy into his arms, ran around the garden, and kept asking Taylor to call him Daddy again. 3 years later, the family celebrated Taylor's 5th birthday. They invited children from their friends' and partners' families for a joyful picnic in the garden, decorated with balloons. Clowns entertained the children, while a pile of colourful gift boxes grew on the terrace with each new arrival. Taylor was overjoyed, and Hannah and Arthur graciously welcomed guests who continuously complimented their wonderful son. Waiters served champagne and appetizers, and fireworks lit up the sky above the Lewis's garden at the end of the celebration, much to the delight of the young guests. After the party, Arthur put Taylor to bed himself. Before sleeping, Taylor made his father promise to help him unpack the presents the next day. After tucking his son in, Arthur went downstairs to the living room, where Hannah was sitting, rubbing her temples. "Are you not feeling well, dear?" Arthur asked. "I have a headache and feel dizzy," Hannah replied. "I probably drank more champagne than I should have. I guess I was just too excited." "Are you sure?" "I'm going to take a pill and go to bed. I'll be fine in the morning. Let's go to the bedroom." However, Hannah didn't feel better in the morning. Arthur put all his business aside and took his wife to the hospital. It was a day he would remember for the rest of his life. The family doctor approached Arthur with a mysterious expression. "What's wrong with her?" asked Arthur. "Is she ill?" "Not at all," smiled the doctor. "She's perfectly healthy. Just a bit pregnant." Arthur didn't immediately grasp the doctor's words. He looked at the doctor as if he were a ghost that had appeared in the middle of the night trying to confuse him. "Just a bit what?" Arthur asked. "Mr. Lewis, your wife is 5 or 6 weeks pregnant, but we need to conduct a more thorough examination." When Hannah came out of the office, she walked up to her husband and looked carefully into his eyes. "Dear, God has rewarded us for giving happiness and a family to Taylor. Now he will have a little brother or sister." 8 months later, the Lewises welcomed a daughter whom they named Piper. Meanwhile, despite marrying Paul, Sarah had no happy expectations. She did not love him, He just wasn't disgusting to her. Paul was reasonably good-looking, owned a small business, a small clothes shop, and had a small apartment. Sarah was tired of her father's daily drunkenness, his nonsensical talk, constant swearing, and the lack of peace. She yearned for a new, calm life and independence. Paul was a regular customer at the supermarket where Sarah worked. He was immediately drawn to the new cashier. He attempted to gain her attention and often complimented her. One day he invited her for a walk after work, and surprisingly, she agreed. Throughout their walk, Paul maintained an animated conversation, while Sarah mostly listened, offering brief responses. They began to see each other occasionally, mostly when Paul could escort Sarah home after work. One day, Paul said to Sarah, as they were saying goodbyes at the entrance, "It's easy for me with you. Shall we live together?" "Together? Like brother or sister? As neighbours? Or maybe as husband and wife?" Sarah asked sarcastically. "Which option do you prefer?" "Why would you say that?" "You know what I mean," Paul responded, somewhat offended that his words weren't taken seriously. "Come on, don't take offence," Sarah said. Soon after that they appeared before the girl's parents, and a month later they tied the knot. Living with Paul initially brought Sarah joy. They had fun together, always going out, visiting the movies and enjoying time in nature. Soon, Sarah left her job in the supermarket to work in Paul's shop. Why pay a salesman when you can sell clothes yourself? All the money goes into the house, Paul persuaded. Sarah gave in to his entreaties, but she regretted it the following winter. The harsh frosts forced her to pile on clothes and wrap herself in shawls to prevent freezing while standing all day in a poorly heated standalone store. "Wait a bit, we'll save up some money and rent a space in a shopping centre," Paul persuaded her. However, Sarah felt as if winter would never end, and they would never save enough money. "Here, have a drink to keep warm." A neighbour who sold women's underwear in the next shop once offered her a flask with heavy drink. "Take a sip. You'll feel warm all over right away." Soon Sarah started carrying the same flask to work. One day after work she found her husband Paul in the kitchen with only a bottle of whiskey and a glass on the table. The man looked at her with a blurry gaze and slammed his fist on the table, making Sarah jump in surprise. "You were lying, vile wench." Paul rose from the chair, his expression menacing and furious. "Paul, I don't understand. Why are you speaking with me like that?" Sarah backed away. "You've been deceiving me all along," the husband sputtered. "I thought you were a modest, quiet, normal woman, but you've been gallivanting with men since school. And not just that. You have been carrying a baby from who knows who." A stinging slap jarred Sarah back to reality. She clutched her burning cheek, looking fearfully at her husband. Fear gave way to resentment, which manifested in tears. Sarah locked herself in the bathroom and cried for an hour. When she emerged, her husband was asleep at the kitchen table, his head resting on his hands. After that incident, Sarah's family life began to deteriorate. Influenced by gossip from acquaintances and neighbours, Paul started treating her poorly. Everyone who discovered who his wife was felt obligated to reveal the truth about Sarah to him. Rumours and gossip stoked the flames of Paul's anger and wounded his pride. His drinking started to increase. One evening, Sarah sat across from him at the table. "We need to have a serious talk," she stated in a calm but firm voice. "What happened in school should not affect our lives now. That chapter is closed, and the past is the past. If you're unhappy living with me, I'll leave." "Why didn't you tell me this yourself?" "What is there to tell? That I gave birth and the baby died in the hospital? Did you really need to know that? What difference would it have made?
A big difference, Sarah, Paul shouted. It would have changed a lot. At least I wouldn't have looked like a fool to everyone else. Everyone knew everything, the whole town, and I was the only one left in the dark. Why have you done this to me?
I didn't think it would matter to you. I thought you married me, not the gossip you're hearing now. I won't apologize. I didn't do anything wrong. Life has just taught me a lesson. A single large tear streamed down Paul's cheek. Sarah felt sorry for her husband. She rose from the table, approached him from behind and hugged him. There was no serious quarrel that evening, but the couple's life went even more wrong. Little by little, Paul stopped doing his shop and replenishing the assortment, so the revenue was falling from month to month. After 5 years, he had to close the business altogether. For the subsequent year, after closing, Paul and Sarah were almost constantly inebriated. Occasionally, Paul's friends, fellow alcoholics, would come over, start fights and cause a ruckus, much to the neighbours' annoyance. Over time, the couple drank away their savings and sold off their belongings for a pittance, all searching for their next drink. In moments of clarity, Sarah realised she needed to change her lifestyle. At such time, she got out her guests and tidied up her home. Her mind urged her, stop drinking, wise up, change your life. However, her husband's hangover demands used to lead her back to old habits. It was a never-ending cycle. This cycle might have continued indefinitely if it were not for an incident that entirely changed Sarah's life. One day she was returning from the store with a bottle in her bag. Her husband was waiting at home, but she didn't want to go back. Instead, she sat on a bench in a public garden, watching yellow leaves gently fall from the trees. It was a beautiful autumn day, the kind poets often write about. Sarah thought that it was a mistake to leave the supermarket, a mistake to go to work at Paul's shop, a mistake to marry Paul at all. Suddenly, a dignified man in a grey raincoat approached her. "Autumn is no time to be sad," he said, speaking to either Sarah or himself. It wasn't clear. The woman turned to look at him. The man had a kind face with bright eyes, crinkled at the corners, appearing about 20 years older than her. "Maybe," she responded, "but there are many other reasons." "Many?" he smiled. "Many." For some reason she felt a desire to talk to this man, to have someone empathise with her. It was as if he sensed it. "Ben." He extended his hand towards her. "Sarah," she responded, his warm handshake causing a stir in her soul, a sense of apprehension she couldn't understand. "You know, Sarah, when my wife passed away, leaving my daughters and me alone, and I sought comfort in what's now in your bag," he said, and acknowledging her surprised expression, added, "Yes, don't be shocked. I saw you at the store." The woman shifted on the bench, feeling embarrassed, being accused of drinking. She had always tried to hide her alcohol consumption from neighbours and acquaintances. Yet this man had easily identified her weakness. "My girls were just 5 and 3 years old," Ben continued. "They really suffered because their mother was no longer there. I wallowed in self-pity. When I realised that I could lose my daughters and end up alone, I realised that alcohol was not the solution. You have to live for those who love and depend on you." "I have no one to live for," Sarah replied. "No one loves me or relies on me." She sighed, lowering her head. If her baby was still alive, she'd have a reason to live. But now, what was there? A husband who couldn't control himself, who wanted nothing more than a bottle. "You're wrong. You just can't see anything around you in your current state." "What is there to see? A drunken husband? I know him like the back of my hand," Sarah responded. "If you like, you can continue this way, but there are other options." said Ben calmly. "You're a young, beautiful woman. Why let your life be ruined?" "I wouldn't call this a life," Sarah replied. "It's a mere existence." "And you don't drink at all anymore?" "Very rare," replied the man. "On holidays I always allow myself to drink with a good meal. I like barbecue. That's a pleasure. Nature in all its glory, fire, glowing coals and aromatic meat on them. How can you resist a small glass of wine?" "Yes," Sarah smiled. "It's been ages since I've been to a barbecue." "Do you want us to change this situation together?" Ben suggested. "Oh, really? Why?" Sarah asked uncomfortably, feeling as if she was imposing on this kind man. "Look at the weather. It's wonderful. I've already missed trips to the countryside. Trust me, you need it right now," he exclaimed. "Well, let's go," she replied uncertainly. "Great. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, meet me here." The man stood up and shook Sarah's hand. "See you tomorrow." Then he turned and left down the alley. For a while Sarah watched this remarkable man, realizing that nothing in life happens without a reason. If fate had unexpectedly brought him into her life, it was a sign. On her way home, Sarah found herself smiling without noticing. She hadn't felt this light and serene in a long time. She arrived home in high spirits. Even Paul, unkempt and inebriated, with his torn t-shirt and worn-out pants, couldn't dampen her mood. Placing a bottle in front of him, Sarah was about to leave the kitchen when he mumbled, "And you? Sit down, dear. Let's drink together." "No, thank you," Sarah replied firmly. She locked herself in the bathroom and stood under the shower for a long time. She felt as though the warm water was rejuvenating her, washing away any traces of past shocks from every skin cell. The next day, dressed in jeans and a jacket, she went to the park, where Ben was already waiting for her. 2 teenage girls were with him. "Meet Sarah. This is Megan and Claire, my daughters." Ben introduced his daughters. "Nice to meet you," Sarah replied. They went to the river and found a cosy spot. Ben set up a grill, pulled out a plastic bucket filled with marinated meat, bread, and vegetables from his backpack. "So, girls, I'll prepare the meat and you handle the rest, okay?" he asked, turning to Sarah and his daughters. "Got it, Daddy," replied the eldest, Claire. Sarah noticed that Ben's daughters were very efficient. They skillfully sliced cucumbers and tomatoes and arranged them on disposable plastic plates. "Do you and Daddy work together?" Megan asked. "No," Sarah replied. "We recently met." "Interesting," Claire said, scrutinizing her father's new acquaintance. "We thought you were a professor too." "Is your dad a professor?" "Of course, he teaches at the college. He teaches students," Megan said proudly. When the meat was ready, everyone sat down on the blanket that served as an improvised table. The picnic was a success. The girls were polite, though they didn't show much interest in Sarah, which made her feel better. Ben poured tea from a thermos and handed it to Sarah. "It's rosehip," said the man. "I make it myself. It's a very useful vitamin drink." "Thank you. You know, I feel so comfortable in your company," Sarah confessed, "as if I've known you for 100 years. "I'm overjoyed," Ben replied, smiling. Sarah returned home late when it was almost completely dark. "Where have you been? Did you bring any beer?" Paul asked grudgingly. "You go yourself, since you need it, and I'm going to bed." Sarah closed the door to the room. Her husband's grumbling could still be heard for a while, and then the front door slammed. The next day, Sarah went to the supermarket early in the morning where she used to work, and she was hired again. And a month later, on her way home, she saw Ben. "Hello, Sarah." "Hello," the woman smiled. "How did you end up here?" Actually, I'm waiting for you." "For me? Why?" Sarah wondered. "I want to talk to you," They walked down the alley in silence. Suddenly Ben stopped and began to talk. He mentioned that he was no longer young and said he didn't think there would ever be a woman in his life. He mentioned his daughters who need a woman's care. After a brief pause, he said, "Sarah, I've been offered a good position at the department in Regional City. They're providing a spacious apartment. Will you come with us?" "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, confused. "Just go with me. I don't demand anything from you. Just be there for me. Be my friend, my companion for the rest of my life," the man pleaded, looking into her eyes with hope. "But—" Sarah began to object, but Ben silenced her with his hand. "Don't say anything. You have a week." He handed her a business card. "Here's my phone number. If you agree to my proposal, I'll be very pleased and happy. Now, let me walk you home. It's late and dark." They walked up to Sarah's place in silence. She didn't need words. She already knew she wanted to be near this mature, intelligent and wise man. A week later, she, with only one bag of belongings, left with Ben and his daughters for the regional city, leaving behind her drinking husband and a life of despair. At the Lewis mansion, a festive mood prevailed. It had been 23 years since Taylor joined the family. Throughout these years, the couple never once regretted adopting him. However, they decided not to reveal the secret of his birth. They loved him deeply, and their affection was reciprocated. For the boy, no one was more precious than his mum and dad, except his younger sister Piper. They were inseparable. When Piper was a baby, her older brother could spend hours with her. The 5-year age difference made him feel wise and authoritative. He always took his sister to the garden, read books to her, and even taught her how to build a snowman. And now Taylor was finishing his studies abroad and was due back home to spend the vacations. So Erin prepared a sumptuous lunch, including Taylor's favourite pie. When the car pulled into the yard, Piper rushed to greet her brother. "Taylor!" she exclaimed, hugging him tightly. "I'm so glad you're here." "Quieten down, you wild thing," Taylor laughed. Following Piper, Hannah and Arthur also stepped onto the terrace. They were all in a happy mood. "How was your flight, son?" Arthur asked, embracing Taylor. "All good, Dad," Taylor replied. After hugging and kissing his mother, they all went inside the house. Once settled in the living room, the parents couldn't help but admire their son. "He's grown so much," Hannah exclaimed. "I can't believe that our little boy is all grown up." "What did you expect? Him to stay small, chasing a ball around the yard and sneaking candies from Erin in the kitchen?" Arthur joked. The family spent the entire day at home enjoying each other's companionship. Looking at how the grown-up children fooled around, Hannah was happy. Only the state of her husband's health marred her happiness. Hannah was awoken in the middle of the night by her husband's cries of pain. Arthur's aches had worsened, and he could no longer bear them. "Hush, darling, I'll get you a pill now," Hannah said, climbing out of bed. "No need, I've already taken one. It's not helping," her husband replied with laboured breaths. "What should I do?" Hannah picked up her cell phone from the nightstand and dialed for an ambulance. By the time the ambulance arrived at their mansion, the whole family was awake. Taylor and Piper were unaware of their father's illness. Their parents had skillfully hidden it from them to avoid causing them extra worries. Arthur was rushed to the hospital, his wife accompanying him. That night, no one in their home managed to sleep. Erin, dressed in a robe and a colourful shawl, brewed coffee for the youngsters. "Erin, did you know?" Taylor asked the housekeeper. "Did you know Father was ill?" "I knew, my dear boy, but I was strictly forbidden to speak about it." She placed cups filled with aromatic beverage in front of Piper and Taylor. "Let's keep our hopes up." "Piper, we need to go to the hospital," Taylor declared. "I'm going to shower, freshen up and then go there." "I'll come with you." Hannah sat in the hospital corridor, her gaze fixated on the blinking "Do Not Enter" sign. Mum, how's Dad? Piper wrapped her arms around her mother, pulling her close. He's not good, sweetheart. But he's going to get better, right? They're going to help him, aren't they? I don't know, my dear. We can only have faith and hope. Mum, where's the doctor? I want to talk to him, Taylor said calmly. The woman dejectedly gestured towards the end of the corridor. The young man confidently walked towards the doctor's office. After knocking, he entered and found the doctor sitting at his desk. Hello, I'm Taylor Lewis, the son of your patient, Arthur Lewis. Have a seat, young man, the doctor suggested. The examination results just came in. Your father's condition is serious. It's quite advanced. Is there nothing that can be done? Taylor asked anxiously. We need a donor, but it's difficult to find one in such a short time. Who can be a donor? Theoretically, close relatives and people who are a match for the patient. Then let me be the donor. Taylor jumped up from his chair. I'm his son. I should match. Your eagerness is commendable, young man, but you need to be examined first. Of course, I'm ready, said Taylor, stepping into the corridor. He approached his mother and sister. Mum, Dad needs a donor. Blood relatives are most likely to be a match. I said I'm ready. Hannah looked at her son, her gaze clouded with grief, devoid of hope. No, son, it most likely won't work out. But why not? I want to help my father myself, don't I? Taylor exclaimed indignantly, puzzled by his mother's despair. I'm young, healthy. I'll recover quickly. For Dad, it's a matter of life and death. Stop and listen to me, his mother commanded in a firm voice, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. You can't be a donor for your father. You are not his blood relative. Taylor froze, as if doused with a bucket of cold water. It was beyond his wildest nightmares to hear such words from his mother. Then she added, You're not our biological child. You're adopted. What are you saying, Mum? Piper asked, frightened. Are you not well? Should we call a doctor? It's true. At home, I'll tell you all about it. Apparently it's time, she said bitterly. Sitting silently in the chair, she rocked side to side, lost in her thoughts. Meanwhile, Taylor slowly meandered down the corridor, eager to escape to the open air. His head spun from the life-altering words he had just heard. People often say that a person can't suffer indefinitely. If God bestows trials, sufferings, and pains upon them, they'll be rewarded with happiness and well-being in due course. This was true for Sarah. She had endured much suffering, a perpetually inebriated father, a stillborn child she couldn't even bury, and a husband who nearly turned her into an alcoholic. But then fate gave her Ben, an adult, wise, educated, and intelligent man. He became the closest and most cherished person in her life. When she moved to the big city with him and his daughters, Sarah felt she'd finally escaped her previously hopeless existence of misery and disappointment. They moved into a spacious 3-bedroom apartment. Ben continued teaching at the university, while Sarah took care of the household. After 5 years of living together, they got married. The girls warmed to Sarah too. They happily helped her with meals and accompanied her on shopping trips. Sarah ensured they were always neat and tidy and kept their school uniforms in order every weekend. She was their confidant, the first to know all their secrets. Sarah was the first one whom Claire told that she was in love and was going to get married, and during the wedding she thanked her stepmother in front of everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us all these years. Sarah and Ben shared more than 20 years together, which were the best years of Sarah's challenging life. Ben, long overdue for retirement, couldn't imagine a life without his students and continued to teach. How can I stay at home and not work? I'll go crazy, become an old man like those sitting on the sofas and condemning everything in the world. Sarah suggested he find a hobby and rest more, considering his increasing heart issues and high blood pressure. However, the dedicated to the work man insisted that his students made him feel alive and needed. Ben passed away at work from a heart attack during a lecture. His daughters Claire and Megan arrived the same day to arrange the funeral. After the wake, they discussed their plans for their father's apartment where Sarah lived. Claire asked, "What are we going to do about the apartment?" Megan suggested renting it out until they could inherit it, given its high value as a 3-bedroom apartment in the city centre. Claire reminded her that Sarah lived there, but Megan replied, "Father once sheltered her, but he's gone now. She should go back to where she came from." And Claire agreed with her sister. The next day they packed Sarah's belongings in a bag and told her, "You don't live here anymore," as they showed her the door. "Girls, where am I going to go?" the woman asked, confused. "That's none of our business," Megan retorted, slamming the door in the face of the woman who had once replaced her and her sister's mother. Sarah navigated the bustling streets of a large city, a sizable bag of belongings in her hand and a few bills in her cloak pocket. Life was teeming all around her. People were rushing somewhere, cars were speeding at breakneck speed, and the soul of the woman, who had grown old and grey from grief, was empty. There was no life in her any more. Sarah purchased a potato pie and tea from a street vendor, then found a seat on a park bench to think. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there. Next to her on the bench still lay an untouched pie and a cold tea when night fell over the city. "I'm sorry, are you feeling ill?" Sarah heard a voice that seemed to come from above. "Wake up!" She raised her head to see a stranger holding a large dog on a leash. The woman sat down next to her. "What happened to you? Should I call an ambulance?" she inquired. At this, Sarah's pent-up sorrow burst forth in a flood of tears. She sobbed uncontrollably. The woman handed her a small bottle of water from her purse. Once Sarah had calmed down, the stranger introduced herself. "My name is Shawnette. It's late, you can't stay here. Let's go to my place." Shawnette helped Sarah up and she followed her without protest. Once again, God supported Sarah by sending her a saviour. Shawnette felt so much for the fate of the old woman that she could not let her go nowhere. She herself had been through a lot in her life. The woman had 4 children, and her husband died when the youngest was not yet a month old. "Stay with us. We have room. There's enough space for everyone," Shawnette offered the next morning. Initially, Sarah was resistant, but Shawnette persuaded her, arguing that she needed help with the children, and Sarah could assume the role of their grandmother. That's precisely what happened. Shawnette's 2 sons and 2 daughters proved to be bright and affectionate children. Within a week, they announced to their friends and neighbours that their grandmother had arrived. Soon, everyone in the big apartment building knew about Sarah, and everyone treated her politely. Thus, Sarah, who seemed destined for loneliness after Ben's death, one more time found a family in the form of Shawnette and her 4 children. And now she was awaiting Shawnette, who went downstairs to speak with strangers. "Who are you?" Shawnette asked the well-dressed young man standing by a huge black jeep, peering into the windows. "I'm looking for Sarah Reed," the young man replied. "Does she live here?" "Perhaps you could introduce yourself first and explain what this is about," Shawnette responded skeptically. "Of course, my name is Taylor Lewis. As far as I've been able to ascertain, Sarah Reed is likely my natural mother." Shawnette's eyebrows raised. "To my knowledge, Sarah has no children." "Let me meet her and speak with her. It's the only way we can uncover the truth." Shawnette eyed the man carefully. "Let's go," she said, heading towards the entrance. The 2 guards followed Taylor, but he stopped them. "Wait here, please." Sarah placed the kettle on the stove and sat at the table. 10 minutes later, Shawnette entered the kitchen, followed by the young man, whom Sarah had noticed at the bottom of the entryway when she looked out the window. "Sarah, I don't understand anything, but this man needs to talk to you," Shaunette said, looking confused. "I'll leave you two alone." "No, stay here, Shaunette." Shaunette sent the children, who were curiously watching the guest, into the room, closed the door, and invited Taylor to sit down. Then she sat down herself. The man remained silent, staring into Sarah's face. Sarah felt like she had seen this young man somewhere before. His face seemed familiar, but she couldn't recall from where. "Are you Sarah Reed?" Taylor finally asked. "Yes." "My name is Taylor Lewis. For many years I've been searching for my mother, who left me at the maternity hospital." Shaunette and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. How could they assist this man? After a brief silence, Taylor continued his story. "I never knew that I was adopted until my father was on his deathbed. It was then that my mother emotionally revealed that she and my father had adopted me when I was very young. At first, I was furious and even left home. Eventually, though, I calmed down and began searching for my birth mother. All I knew was the name of the town and that my 16-year-old mother had left me at the maternity hospital shortly after birth. I imagined countless times how I would find her and express my feelings towards mothers like her. But then I would mentally thank her for my existence. After all, I have a happy, prosperous life, the world's best parents, and a sister whom I deeply love. Unfortunately, all my searches turned up nothing. The trail went cold at the maternity hospital. There was a small fire, and the documents were lost. No one remembered me, except one young cleaner. At the moment of my birth, she was cleaning the hospital corridor, and she overheard a conversation between the doctor and the grandfather of a newborn premature boy. The grandfather demanded to sign a waiver. "I am a father. My daughter is a minor, so I have the right to decide for her," the man stated loudly. The cleaner was so profoundly affected by the father's decision that she remembered the incident for the rest of her life. She also told me that she heard that the young mother had been told her baby had died, but she saw herself that the boy was sent to the orphanage. That's when I realized my own mother didn't know I was alive, and I got the leads that led me to you. Taylor fell silent. He looked at Sarah, who listened to his story in silence, tears streaming down their cheeks. She could not believe that her father could commit such a cruel act. He was long gone, and there was no one to question. Sarah was filled with grief and joy as she realized her son was alive. She wanted to stand and embrace her son, but her body was frozen in place. Tears were also streaming down Taylor's face, and he struggled with a lump in his throat. Finally, he swallowed hard and confidently declared, "I've found you, Mum. Now we'll never part again."
Hola, suscríbete a Historias Vitales para no perderte nuevas historias. Mi esposa había estado trabajando en su proyecto especial durante 4 meses ahora. No era su proyecto personal, pero ella era la persona principal y responsable de su éxito. El proyecto estaba diseñado para salvar a su empresa, Bixler Enterprises. Los últimos 4 meses habían sido difíciles porque se vio obligada a trabajar duro. Era importante tanto para ella como para la empresa. Había una buena posibilidad de que Bixler Enterprises quebrara si el proyecto no se completaba. Sarah tenía una licenciatura de Albrecht y un MBA de Wharton. Era la más inteligente de la familia. Yo empecé a trabajar como mecánico de autos justo después de la secundaria y después de 21 años seguía siendo mecánico de autos. No me importaba porque me gustaba el trabajo y pagaba bien. Era suficiente para pagar la universidad de Sarah y criar a 2 hijos. No vivíamos lujosamente, pero estábamos bien. Los niños ya se habían mudado, y las cosas iban bastante bien con nuestros ingresos. Sara quedó embarazada 3 meses después de casarnos a la edad de 18 años. Durante los primeros años de nuestro matrimonio, vivimos con mis padres. Ellos tenían una gran casa vacía ya que 4 de mis hermanos se habían mudado. Eso significaba que teníamos una niñera mientras Sara completaba sus primeros años de universidad. Debido a 2 embarazos, la carrera de 4 años le llevó 6 años completarla. Fue difícil, pero lo logró. Siempre tuve trabajo y nunca me faltó trabajo extra si lo necesitaba. Después de que Sara se graduó de Wharton, alquilamos nuestro propio lugar. Tuvo ofertas de trabajo de varias empresas grandes, pero todas requerían que nos mudáramos. A mí no me importaba, pero Sara quería quedarse cerca de casa. Por eso decidió trabajar en Bixler Enterprises. Pagaba bien, pero lo más importante, le daba responsabilidad y la oportunidad de avanzar. Sara era una empleada trabajadora y dedicada. La presentación es el jueves en el Hotel Thyssen en Filadelfia. Tomé unos días libres en el trabajo para ayudarla según fuera necesario. Al final, todo lo que logré fue hacerle algo de comer cuando llegaba a casa. No sabía nada sobre su trabajo, ni tampoco quería saber, los negocios corporativos de alto nivel me aburrían. Empresarios de Europa, Asia y América del Sur venían aquí, la empresa pagaba sus boletos de avión y proporcionaba habitaciones en el Hotel Thyssen mientras estaban aquí. Era caro como el infierno, y por algunas cosas que Sara había dicho, la empresa estaba sobreestimando sus finanzas. Su presentación era importante para ella, para la empresa y para más de 200 empleados. Hasta el martes por la noche, todo iba bien. Sara llegó a casa con un traje nuevo, un traje gris con una blusa blanca. Desplegó todo lo que necesitaba en la cama de la habitación de invitados. Cuando se trataba de la limpieza de la casa, ella era normal, pero cuando se trataba del trabajo, era meticulosa. No entendía por qué necesitaba sacar su ropa interior de lujo, pero no dije nada. Además de su traje para la presentación, tenía varios vestidos de cóctel lindos para eventos sociales antes y después del evento. Siempre había evitado tales eventos, pero me sentía obligado a ir con ella si ella quería que lo hiciera. Me agradeció la oferta, pero dijo que no era necesario. Todos los materiales y equipos que necesitaba estaban guardados ordenadamente en el maletero de su Volvo. Antes de salir del trabajo, ella misma conducía el coche para asegurarse de que todo estuviera en perfectas condiciones. Tenía todo el día miércoles para prepararse y toda la noche del miércoles para socializar con sus invitados. Sara era tan buena en lo que hacía que sentía que habría sido mejor si simplemente me hubiera mantenido alejado de ella. Finalmente, había terminado. Lo había revisado y vuelto a revisar todo. Todo lo que necesitaba ahora era una ducha caliente y una buena noche de sueño. Supongo que mi error fue que empecé a revisar sus cosas después de que Sara comenzara a ducharse. Pensé que estaba ayudando, pero resultó ser lo contrario. Estaba moviendo cosas en la cama cuando un pequeño sobre blanco cayó del bolsillo lateral de su bolso de maquillaje. Una carta de una farmacia, pero no del tipo que solemos usar. Dentro había 10 pastillas. No tenía idea de qué era, Pren, y las instrucciones eran confusas. Si es necesario, tomar una pastilla y luego una segunda pastilla 12 horas después. Pensé que podría ser algo que ella había conseguido para la ansiedad o los nervios, pero las instrucciones no tenían sentido. La receta estaba escrita a su nombre el lunes. Volví a poner el sobre en su lugar mientras ella terminaba de ducharse. Decidí que quería saber más sobre Pren antes de contarle sobre ello. Por supuesto, si lo mencionaba, significaría que estaba revisando sus cosas. Odio los dilemas. Mientras Sara se preparaba para dormir, fui a nuestro ordenador doméstico y busqué. 10 minutos después, me uní a mi esposa bajo las sábanas. Pasé toda la noche despierto, preguntándome por qué mi esposa había recogido una receta para la píldora del día después, especialmente después de que me hicieran una vasectomía hace 10 años. A la mañana siguiente, me levanté temprano, pero no estaba descansado. Di un largo paseo, esperando que despejara mi mente. Me dirigí hacia casa con reticencia, temiendo lo que podría hacer o decir cuando llegara allí. Mi hijo Joe se unió a la Marina después de la escuela secundaria y estaba en su primer año en San Diego. Nuestra hija Gloria se casó con su amor de la infancia el año pasado y acababa de mudarse a Dallas. Eso dejaba solo a Sara y a mí. Echaba de menos a los niños, pero esperaba envejecer con mi esposa. Ella era la única mujer que me había interesado, y ahora todo estaba. Si Sara estaba teniendo una aventura, lo ocultaba bien. Por supuesto, nunca la vigilé. Nunca miré sus correos electrónicos o llamadas telefónicas. No tenía razones para hacerlo. No tenía forma de saber qué estaba haciendo en el trabajo o después del trabajo. Confiaba en ella completamente. Ion, ¿dónde demonios has estado? ¿Quieres huevos o algo? No, solo café. No me sentía con muchas ganas de hablar. ¿Qué pasa, cariño? Solo son 3 días. Puedes venir si quieres, pero te aburrirás como una ostra. No, realmente no quiero ir, pero odio dejarte sola. Me preocupo cuando no estás aquí. Es muy dulce, querido, pero estará bien. No voy a salir del hotel en todo este tiempo. Pasaré la mayor parte del día asegurándome de que la sala de conferencias esté lista, y esta noche tendré una agradable charla con nuestros posibles clientes. Mañana, probablemente ni siquiera tendré la oportunidad de ir al baño. Llegaré a casa lo más temprano posible el viernes, te prometo un gran fin de semana si sabes a lo que me refiero. Todo eso suena bien, pero no puedes culparme por preocuparme. Soy un mecánico de autos, y tengo una esposa hermosa y exitosa. A veces tengo la sensación de que estás menos interesada en mejorar nuestra situación familiar que en avanzar en tu carrera. Detente, maldita sea, Ion. Siempre he respetado lo que haces para ganarte la vida y nunca he insinuado lo contrario. Criaste a 2 grandes niños y me pusiste a través de la universidad. Eres un gran esposo, un gran padre y un buen proveedor, y nunca olvides eso. Terminé mi café mientras ella recogía la mesa. ¿Quieres que te llame? No, no es una buena idea. Tendré el móvil apagado, y voy a apagar el teléfono de la habitación por la noche para poder dormir. Te llamaré siempre que pueda. La ayudé a cargar el coche, era tan meticulosa con eso como con todo lo demás. Trabajando, le llevaría 3 horas llegar al Hotel Dicen. Me quedé en el porche y la vi marcharse. No me molesté en preguntarle por las pastillas. Pasé el resto de la mañana en el porche. No recuerdo haberme preocupado tanto como ahora. Me sentía pequeño e insignificante. Me sentía fuera de mi liga. Era un tipo de pueblo con un trabajo mediocre y una esposa exitosa. Era una combinación equivocada. Debería haberlo notado antes. Me sentía estúpido. El mejor traje que tenía era una chaqueta azul y un par de pantalones. Al menos tenía algunas corbatas, aunque tenían 10 años de antigüedad. Acababa de terminar de vestirme cuando sonó el teléfono fijo. Oye, cariño, solo quería avisarte de que llegué bien. ¿Tuviste un buen viaje? Supongo que el tráfico no estaba demasiado denso. Estuvo bien. Te llamaré esta noche. Ahora tengo que irme. Estoy en la habitación 714, Sara. Puedo estar en casa de mis padres o en la de mis hermanos esta noche si quieres llamarme a mi móvil. De acuerdo. Suena el teléfono móvil. Te quiero, tengo que irme. Me tomé mi tiempo para llegar a Filadelfia. No fui directo al Dicen, primero me detuve y compré un filete con queso. Prometí hacer una larga noche. No estaba seguro de qué iba a hacer. Estacioné en el garaje del hotel y simplemente esperé. Tarde o temprano, tenía que entrar en el hotel. Simplemente no podía decidir cuándo hacerlo. El sonido de mi teléfono celular me ayudó a tomar mi decisión. Ion, solo quería avisarte de que todo se ha arreglado. Ahora voy a bajar para encontrarme con algunas personas y cenar. No olvidaste nada, ¿verdad? No, todo está bien. Tengo todo en mi habitación para mañana. ¿Necesitas algo? No, Ion, relájate. Voy a apagar mi teléfono. Te llamaré mañana por la mañana. ¿De acuerdo? Ríe, diviértete. No es divertido, Ion, es trabajo. No parecía estar demasiado fuera de lugar. El vestíbulo, el restaurante y las salas de conferencias estaban llenos de gente, así que pude pasar desapercibido. Había un folleto pequeño y bonito que mostraba el diseño de todas las habitaciones del hotel. Me paseé por las diferentes habitaciones y me detuve en las paredes, mirando alrededor entre la multitud. No tenía ni idea de qué haría si Sara me veía. Lo averiguaría si y cuando eso sucediera. Encontré un tablero de eventos que enumeraba todas las habitaciones que estaban siendo utilizadas por los diversos grupos. Bixler Enterprises no tenía habitaciones disponibles para el miércoles por la noche. Esto me pareció interesante. Sara había dicho que no iba a salir del hotel, pero ahora no estaba tan seguro de eso. Había 3 comedores, familiar, informal y de alta cocina. A Sara no le gustaba mucho cenar con niños, así que fui primero al comedor informal. Solo me llevó 5 minutos asegurarme de que no estaba allí. Tuve mejor suerte en el salón gourmet, era una acogedora mesita encajada en la esquina, el tipo de mesa que la gente reserva para tener un encuentro privado. Sara llevaba un vestido de cóctel negro con un escote pronunciado y perlas, se veía elegante y su acompañante parecía apreciarlo. Conocía a algunas personas con las que trabajaba Sara, y él no era una de ellas. Me resultaba familiar, pero no había forma de que pudiera recordarlo. Había muchas sillas libres, así que no tuve problemas para cruzar la sala. Había velas y pequeños candelabros de cristal en las mesas. Apagué la mía y le dije al camarero que me molestaba por el glaucoma. Pedí el plato de pollo de siempre y me acomodé. El camarero me sirvió el café por tercera vez. Disculpe, el tipo en la mesa de enfrente me parece muy familiar. ¿Sabes quién es? Sí, ese es Malcolm Eugene Foote. Es miembro del Consejo Municipal, se espera que se postule para el Congreso en los próximos años. ¿Es esa su esposa con él? Es muy bonita. No, esta es la primera vez que la veo. Siempre usa esa mesa para señoras especiales, si me entiende. Simplemente le sonreí y pedí la cuenta. Nunca había visto a Sara tan sensual con un hombre antes. Parecía captar cada palabra que decía, como si fuera Dios o algo así. No estaban haciendo nada inapropiado, pero tampoco era platónico ni profesional. Cuando me fui, estaban terminando su segunda botella de vino. Ahora entendía por qué se había llevado su lencería elegante. Me acomodé en una esquina del vestíbulo para que no me vieran. 10 minutos después, salieron del restaurante. Ella le tomaba la mano mientras caminaban por el vestíbulo hacia el ascensor. Observé cuidadosamente los indicadores de piso. Que el ascensor se detuviera en el 3er piso era una buena señal, significaba que no lo había llevado a su habitación. Era una mala señal cuando el ascensor no llegaba al 7º piso, significaba que ella fue a su habitación. Por si acaso me equivocaba en algo, me senté en el vestíbulo y observé el ascensor durante 1 hora. La gente entraba y salía, pero Sara no estaba entre ellos. Saqué mi maleta vacía del coche y me dirigí al mostrador de recepción. Aunque podía demostrar que era su esposo, me costó trabajo conseguir una tarjeta llave. Se dieron después de llamar a la habitación, pero nadie respondió. Finalmente, estaba en camino a la habitación 714 con la tarjeta llave. Ni siquiera encendí las luces al principio, simplemente me senté en la oscuridad de la habitación durante más de 1 hora. No fue difícil asegurarme de que no regresara a la habitación. Primero, empacé todas sus ropas y pertenencias personales. No dejé nada atrás. Revisé el paquete de Preven, todavía quedaban 10 pastillas en el tocador. De manera muy ordenada, estaban todos los artículos que necesitaría para su presentación al día siguiente. Comencé a llenar la maleta. Había 24 carpetas promocionales especialmente encuadernadas y otras 20 carpetas regulares, todas ellas fueron a la maleta. Un proyector digital fue lo siguiente, seguido de una computadora portátil. Tomé su bolso y su celular, que había dejado en la habitación. Todo lo que tenía consigo era un bolso de mano y probablemente un tubo de lápiz labial. Di una vuelta por la habitación tan cuidadosamente como lo hizo ella para asegurarme de no perder nada. Una vez satisfecho, dejé las llaves del coche y mi anillo de bodas en el tocador. Aparte de esos dos objetos, la habitación estaba completamente vacía. El ascensor se dirigió directamente al estacionamiento, no tuve problemas para llevar 2 maletas, y 20 minutos después, estaba en la autopista rumbo al norte. Pasaban las 3 de la madrugada, no tenía idea de que había pasado tanto tiempo. 1 hora o 2 después, sonó mi teléfono celular, la identificación de llamadas mostraba el número del Listen. Sí, ¿dónde estás? Estaré en casa pronto. Eso fue todo lo que dije. Hubo silencio en el otro extremo de la línea. Los vendedores tienen un viejo dicho, el primero que habla pierde. Pareció una eternidad antes de que ella hablara. Ion, lo siento. No preguntó nada y simplemente colgó. Apagué mi teléfono, era obvio que había regresado a su habitación. Más tarde ese día, tenía que dar una presentación que salvaría a su empresa y le daría un ascenso. Metí las maletas en el desván del garaje. Sara nunca iba allí y nunca pensó en buscar algo allí. Por supuesto, en este punto, estoy bastante seguro de que no importaba. Primero, recogí todas mis ropas y pertenencias personales. La mayoría de los hombres tienen sus propias herramientas, generalmente es un requisito para el trabajo. Pasé por la tienda, cargué las mías en el Subaru y recogí mi último cheque de pago. Para entonces, los bancos ya estaban abiertos, no tuve que hacer ninguna manipulación financiera complicada. Simplemente retiré todo el dinero de mis cuentas. Almorcé en Hagerstown, Maryland. Tenía suficiente dinero para vivir durante unos años, pero sabía que estaría buscando trabajo muy pronto. Sara y yo éramos parecidos en eso de que a ambos nos encantaba trabajar. La voy a extrañar. Pasé un par de horas en las cuevas del Uray y alquilé una habitación cerca de Whitewell. No tenía idea de qué iba a hacer. Era sábado, y me encontré sentado en el acuario de Chattanooga, observando la naturaleza que nunca había visto antes. Pasé unas horas simplemente relajándome y decidí que era un buen lugar para estar. Compré un pase anual para el acuario y, para la hora de la cena, tenía un lugar donde quedarme. Era un remolque móvil en el parque, pero estaba amueblado y era económico. No necesitaba mucho. La primera cosa que haría el lunes por la mañana sería conseguir un trabajo. Un buen hombre de mantenimiento siempre puede conseguir un trabajo, especialmente si está dispuesto a trabajar duro. Podría permanecer discreto hasta que fuera el momento de renovar mi licencia de conducir o las etiquetas del coche. Me preocuparé por eso cuando llegue el momento. El domingo por la tarde, llamé a Gloria. Me sentí obligado a informarle sobre lo que estaba sucediendo, pero Sara ya se lo había contado. Fue bastante franca con Gloria sobre lo que había pasado. Dijo que había engañado, que la sorprendí, que me fui y que ella perdió su trabajo. Me sentí mal porque ella perdió su trabajo, pero ese era el precio que tenía que pagar. Le pedí a Gloria que le dijera a Josh lo que estaba sucediendo la próxima vez que hablara con él. También le dije que la llamaría aproximadamente una vez al mes para verificar cómo iban las cosas. No le dije dónde estaba. Para el mediodía del día siguiente, tenía un trabajo. En realidad, estaba a poca distancia del parque de remolques, con el Waffle House a mitad de camino. ¿Qué más podría querer un hombre? No sé cómo manejaron el papeleo, pero me estaban pagando $20 por hora sin hacer preguntas. Estaba feliz, y ellos también. Ni siquiera tendría que tocar el dinero que traje conmigo. Unos 2 meses después, Gloria me informó que Sara se había mudado de la casa y estaba viviendo con sus padres. Gloria no sabía nada más, pero estaba feliz de que estuviera estable y le estuviera yendo bien. Joss me llamó desde San Diego solo para informarme que iba a hacer un crucero. Era técnico en aviónica en un portaaviones, intentó explicar qué hacía exactamente, pero estaba más allá de mi comprensión. Nunca supe mucho sobre cosas técnicas. Ambos tuvieron cuidado de no decir nada malo sobre su madre, aprecié eso. Después de eso, todo siguió como siempre. Comencé a hablar con Gloria al menos semanalmente, Joss y yo comenzamos a enviar correos electrónicos regularmente. Gloria hablaba regularmente con Sara, pero decía muy poco sobre lo que estaba haciendo o dónde estaba. Nunca presenté la solicitud de divorcio, y parece que Sara tampoco lo hizo. Tengo una licencia de conducir de Tennessee y las etiquetas en el Subaru. Comencé a frecuentar un bar local un par de veces al mes y tuve encuentros casuales, 2 mujeres se alternaban como mis compañeras nocturnas regulares. No buscaban compromisos, y yo tampoco, parecía funcionar bien para todos nosotros. La vida era buena. Eso fue hace mucho tiempo, y gradualmente olvidé a Sara. Con el tiempo, el Subaru comenzó a darme problemas, había olvidado cuánto tiempo había pasado. Tenía más de 200,000 millas. Estaba reflexionando sobre esto con una jarra de cerveza un día cuando me di cuenta de que habían pasado casi 5 años desde que me fui de casa. Mantuve un contacto cercano con ambos hijos, Gloria ya tenía 2 hijos propios en este momento y quería que los visitara. Joss casi se casó con una mujer tailandesa, pero en el último momento, se negó. Por lo general, trabajaba 6 días a la semana y usaba el domingo para recuperarme del sábado por la noche, no había ninguna buena razón para que alguien llamara a la puerta de mi remolque a las 6 de la mañana de un viernes. Su grosería fue recompensada por un hombre medio desnudo abriendo la puerta, los calzoncillos del día son repugnantes, y la dama en la puerta, juzgando por la expresión en su rostro, estuvo de acuerdo conmigo. Ella apartó la mirada, pero su compañero no parecía impresionado. Norm habría usado pantalones, pero en un momento como este, los invitados me molestaron. Estamos buscando a John Terrell. No los conozco. Me llamo David Simmons, y esta es mi esposa Mara. Tenemos un problema y esperamos que nos puedas ayudar. Lo siento mucho, no trabajo a altas horas de la noche. Si necesitan algo relacionado con su auto, tendrán que ir a la tienda. Esto provocó varias miradas en blanco y finalmente una respuesta. No tiene nada que ver con tu trabajo, es más un problema personal. ¿Podemos entrar? El interior del remolque lucía desordenado, rara vez tenía invitados, así que rara vez lo limpiaba. Incluso mis novias insistían en que fuéramos a su lugar. Hagan como en su casa, déjenme ponerme los pantalones enseguida. Al entrar en el dormitorio, dejé la puerta abierta solo para mostrarles lo hospitalario que soy. También me puse una camisa. ¿Les gustaría tomar café? Solo tomará unos 10 minutos. Aparté algunas cosas del sofá para que pudieran sentarse, no hubo respuesta a la pregunta del café. Tenemos una hija adoptiva de 4 años y otra de 2 que necesita un trasplante de médula ósea, y esperamos que nos puedas ayudar. Estamos dispuestos a pagarte si es necesario. ¿Con mi médula ósea? No, queremos usarla y estamos dispuestos a compensarte por cualquier inconveniente. Creo que quieren comprarla. Estaba actuando como un listillo, y de repente me di cuenta de ello. Estas personas eran serias, tenían un problema real y estaban buscando ayuda. Lo siento mucho, no quise interrumpir. Por favor, continúen. Nuestra mejor oportunidad de encontrar un donante es un familiar cercano. Eres nuestra mejor esperanza. Mira esto. No quiero ser un grosero, pero creo que se equivocaron de persona. ¿Cuándo nació su hija? Cumplirá 5 años en julio. Marche Simmons habló por primera vez, y sonó sincera. Odio ser el portador de malas noticias, pero me hice una vasectomía hace 15 años. No hay forma de que pueda ser su padre. ¿Por qué tu nombre estaba en el certificado de nacimiento? No puedo responder eso, tal vez deberían preguntarle a su madre. Esa afirmación fue recibida con silencio. Sentí pena por estas personas, pero no sabía cómo ayudarles. ¿Cuál es el nombre de la madre? Sarah Lise Terrell. No encontraba las palabras. Tal vez no debería haber tomado esas malditas pastillas de ella, por supuesto, entonces esas personas no tendrían una hija en absoluto. Todo lo que pensaba que había superado el dolor, y aquí está de nuevo, viejos recuerdos de mi esposa teniendo relaciones sexuales con ese maldito político de Filadelfia. Estaba empezando a olvidarlo todo, y ahora estaba de vuelta. Maldita sea. Ahora entiendo y pido disculpas por mi grosería e insensibilidad. Haré todo lo que esté en mi poder para ayudarles. En primer lugar, porque no puede Sara hacerse un trasplante de médula ósea. Médicamente, no puede. ¿Por qué no? Es madre, tiene que ser una donante adecuada. Ella es una donante adecuada, pero está demasiado enferma. Los médicos se negaron siquiera a considerar utilizarla. ¿Enferma de qué? Está muriendo de insuficiencia hepática. Le quedan menos de 6 meses de vida. Esto no tiene sentido. Siempre ha estado perfectamente sana. Además, no creo que un hígado enfermo le impida donar médula ósea. El hospital no aceptará su firma en el formulario de consentimiento. ¿Estás diciendo que hay algo mal en su cabeza? Ambos me miraron en silencio, sabían la respuesta, pero no querían decirlo. En ese momento, no quería que se sintieran aún más incómodos. Hace 10 minutos, no me importaban, pero ahora sentía que tenía que protegerlos y ayudarlos. ¿Cómo sucedió esto? ¿Podría alguno de mis hijos ayudar? Quizás, pero pensamos que eras nuestra mejor esperanza. ¿Por qué no van tras su padre, su verdadero padre? Pensamos que eras tú. No tenemos ni idea de quién más podría ser. Sara no nos dijo nada sobre otro posible padre. De hecho, ella no estaba en condiciones de explicar nada, agregó Mara. Obtuvimos la mayoría de nuestra información de la agencia de adopción. Tuve que preparar café y hacer pis, permítanme un momento. Dejé a mis invitados sentados mientras preparaba el café. Solo tomó unos minutos. Mientras se preparaba, fui al baño, algo que necesitaba hacer urgentemente. Traté de ser discreto, ya había avergonzado lo suficiente a Mara. ¿Dónde viven? En Westchester, Pensilvania. Les haré una oferta. Si les digo quién es el verdadero padre de su hija, deben prometerme que lo perseguirán sin descanso hasta obtener lo que desean. ¿De qué estás hablando? El padre de su hija es un político prominente en Pensilvania. Por supuesto, negará todo y probablemente les proporcionará documentos legales para detener sus esfuerzos. Si acuerdan presionar lo suficiente para que él admita que la niña es suya, podrán avergonzarlo y obligarlo a hacerse un trasplante de médula ósea. Eso es lo que quieren, ¿verdad? Sí, claro, pero ¿cómo hacemos eso? No lo sé. Soy mecánico. Trabajo con metal para ganarme la vida. Creo que la mejor manera sería utilizar la televisión, la radio y los periódicos. Los políticos harán cualquier cosa para evitar una mala publicidad. ¿Tienen amigos que puedan ayudar? Bueno, ahora ambos estaban sonriendo. Debo haber dicho algo que les dio esperanza. Creo que podemos hacer esto. ¿Quién demonios es él? Malcolm Eugene Foote. Se postula para el Senado de los Estados Unidos. Apuesto a que hará cualquier cosa para evitar una mala publicidad. El café estaba listo, pero David y Marchen no podían esperar para llegar a casa. Antes de irse, les dije cómo ponerse en contacto con Gloria y Joss en caso de que los necesitaran. Estaba seguro de que ayudarían. También les pedí que me dijeran dónde estaba Sara. Probablemente estaría en Pensacola antes de que ellos regresaran a Westchester. Me corté el pelo y compré una camisa nueva. Sara era una tramposa que arruinó mi vida, pero aún así quería lucir bien cuando la viera. Era otro remolque, pero esta vez era un bonito doble nuevo. Allí estaba su Volvo con una llanta desinflada y un parabrisas roto. La mujer que abrió la puerta no era Sara, parecía que la habían empapado fuerte y la habían dejado empapada. Tenía al menos 45, tal vez 50, y debió haber tenido una vida difícil. La falta de maquillaje no ayudaba y simplemente se veía horrible. No tuve la oportunidad de abrir la boca. Caray, si no es John Terrell. Nunca esperé verte aquí. Tuve que usar la vieja línea, me estás poniendo en desventaja. Sherry Hart. Pasa, entra. ¿Quieres una cerveza? No, pero gracias. Estoy aquí para ver a Sara. Sherry cruzó la habitación y se detuvo en el buffet del comedor. Aquí está, John. Mírala todo lo que quieras. Su mano señalaba una urna de latón que estaba en el centro del buffet vacío. Supongo que llegué demasiado tarde. No me moví, solo me quedé mirando el contenedor frente a mí. ¿Puedo tomar una cerveza ahora? Sara se mudó a Pensacola después de dar a su bebé en adopción. Compró el remolque con el dinero que recibió de Bixler Enterprises después de que la despidieron. Tenía una participación en las ganancias, 401k, y vacaciones y días de enfermedad. Eventualmente, consiguió un trabajo en una fábrica local de prendas de vestir donde trabajaba en el departamento de envíos. Allí fue donde conoció a Sherry. Sherry alquilaba una habitación de Sara. Cada centavo que Sara ganaba iba para el alcohol. Empezó con vino y gradualmente pasó a bebidas más fuertes, las más baratas. Eventualmente, perdió su trabajo debido a su alcoholismo y se vio obligada a usar sus ahorros. Nunca salió con nadie ni salió a ningún lado. Sherry se quedó con ella, pagó sus servicios públicos y compró alimentos que Sara no comía. Le llevó más de 3 años quitarse la vida. Increíblemente, ella tenía un testamento y me dejó un doble remolque y un Volvo. Sherry explicó que Sara estaba tan angustiada por lo que había hecho que simplemente se rindió. No intentó evitar el embarazo ni siquiera terminarlo. La adopción se había arreglado meses antes de que naciera el bebé. Nunca volvió a trabajar, excepto en los trabajos clandestinos que hacía mal. Sherry dijo que Sara no parecía tener ambición ni propósito en la vida. Sara hablaba mucho de mí pero tenía miedo de intentar contactarme. Gloria le dio mi número, pero nunca me llamó. Era como si su aventura de una noche la hubiera lastimado más a ella que a mí. Estuve allí durante 2 semanas y luego vendí el remolque de Sherry por $1 y obtuve $3,000 por el Volvo. 2 días después, estaba en Westchester visitando a mis nuevos amigos David y Marche. Malcolm Eugene Foote resistió al principio, pero David y Marche lo presionaron hasta que cedió. Insistió en pruebas de ADN, que demostraron que era el padre. Para salvar la cara, más o menos lo obligaron a someterse a un trasplante de médula ósea, que fue exitoso. La carrera política y la vida familiar de Malcolm no dejaron una impresión favorable. Su caída en las encuestas fue tan rápida que el partido lo reemplazó por otro candidato unos meses antes de las elecciones. Su esposa solicitó el divorcio y fue muy pública al respecto. Sara y yo estamos viajando ahora a Dallas para ver a Gloria y a mis nietos. No sé cuánto tiempo mantendré a Sara conmigo, probablemente hasta que tenga a alguien.